The fluorescent light above courtroom 4B buzzed like it needed replacing years ago. I kept my palms flat against the table, pressing down until the shaking stopped, the way you'd hold a lid on something about to boil over. Daniel leaned toward the microphone stand like he'd rehearsed the distance in a mirror. "She has nothing without my name," he said, and let it sit there, satisfied the way he used to let silences sit after he'd already won an argument at the dinner table. I didn't look at him. I reached into my bag and set my notebook down beside my legal pad. Small. Spiral-bound. The green cover had gone soft and cracked at the corners, and there was a coffee ring stamped into the front like a brand right over the spine. I didn't open it. I just let it sit there next to my pen like it belonged. By the end of this hearing, I told myself everyone in this room would know exactly whose name had ever mattered here and whose hadn't. The judge's eyes moved from Daniel to me and finally landed on the notebook. He held them there a second too long. "Counsel," he said, glancing at my lawyer, "let's hold that thought. 8 months earlier I hadn't even known that notebook would end up in this room. I hadn't known most of what I was about to find out. My name is Marianne Weller. I'm 38 and I work as a paralegal at a 5-person family law firm in Dayton, Ohio, which is a strange thing to say out loud when you consider I took the job 3 weeks after I filed for my own divorce. I didn't plan it that way. I just needed steady income, and Loretta Finch, who runs the firm, said she liked that I already understood what our clients were going through. I didn't tell her how much. I'm not a person who raises her voice. I never have been. If you'd met me at the office, you'd have seen a woman who color codes case files and drinks her coffee lukewarm because she forgets it's there. I don't argue. I highlight. I underline. If something matters, I mark it and I come back to it later when I have time to be right about it instead of loud about it. That habit, I think, came from Walt. Walt was my father-in-law, Daniel's father, and for the 11 years I was married into that family, he was the only one who ever looked at me like I was a whole person and not an arrangement. He used to sit with me on the back porch while Daniel and Carol talked over each other inside, and he'd just let me be quiet. 2 years before he died, he told me something I didn't understand the weight of until much later. "Keep good records, Marianne," he said, turning his coffee mug slowly on the porch rail. "Records outlive people's memories of what they promised." I thought he meant something small. A checkbook. A calendar. I didn't know he meant everything. Carol, Daniel's mother, never looked at me that way. To Carol, I was something closer to staff who happened to have a wedding ring. She'd ask me to refill drinks at her own dinner parties while introducing Daniel to guests, as though he'd personally built the house we lived in. Daniel was her son. Whatever he wanted, she found a way to justify, and whatever I wanted, she found a way to overlook. It was a Tuesday in March, nothing special about it, when Daniel said the thing that first made me uneasy. We were splitting laundry, not even looking at each other, and he mentioned, almost bored, that his mother had been talking to a realtor friend about our house. "Not that it matters," he said, folding a towel in half. "The house was always going to be mine anyway." He said it the way you'd mention the weather. Like a fact so obvious it didn't need defending. I didn't say anything back. I just remembered it. And that night, for the first time in years, I got out a notebook and wrote down the date. By November, Daniel and I were separated in every way except the paperwork, though nobody at that table seemed to have gotten the memo, or maybe they'd simply chosen not to read it. Carol hosted Thanksgiving the way she always did, with the good china out and a seating chart she pretended not to have thought about in advance. When I walked in with a green bean casserole still warm through the dish towel, she was already steering Priya, Daniel's new girlfriend, toward the head of the table. "Sit here, sweetheart," Carol said, patting the chair beside her own. "Since you're part of the family now." Then she turned to me, smiling the same smile she used for the mailman. "Marianne, honey, would you mind sitting with the kids? Just to keep an eye on things." I looked at the kids' table. 6 children under 10 and a bowl of cranberry sauce someone was about to knock over. I looked at Daniel, who was studying his wine like it had just said something interesting. He didn't correct his mother. He didn't so much as glance my way. He just smiled into the glass and let it happen the way he let most things happen, when correcting them would have cost him something. I sat with the kids. I cut somebody's turkey into smaller pieces. And I listened to Carol 3 feet away tell her sister that Daniel had been thinking about refinishing the floors in his house before spring. His house. Not ours. Not even theirs. His. The mortgage had both our names on it. I'd signed beside his signature 9 years ago at a kitchen table that didn't exist anymore in a bank branch that had since become a coffee shop. But somewhere in the last year, in Carol's telling, my name had quietly stopped being part of the story. I didn't say anything. I never do in the moment. I just noticed. When it was time to leave, I went looking for my coat in the front closet, and Carol's purse had slid off the shelf onto the bench below it, spilling open. I wasn't looking for anything. I was only trying to set it back before someone stepped on it. That's when I saw the folded paper sticking out of the side pocket. A real estate flyer, glossy, the kind that gets left in mailboxes. 3 listings circled in blue pen under a header that read similar homes in the area. I stood there in that closet a long moment, coat half on, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold at the same time. They weren't just talking about the house like it was his. They were already looking for mine. The county recorder's office didn't tell me anything I didn't already know about the deed. Both our names were still on a clean, unchanged file the way it should be. But 2 days after that, when I logged into our joint savings account to move money for the electric bill, I found $14,283 missing. Not spent. Moved. The balance had dropped in 3 transfers over a single week, none of which I'd made. If you're watching this from a family gathering right now, sitting through something you can't say out loud yet, tell me where you're tuning in from. I'd like to know I'm not the only one sitting at somebody else's table. I asked Daniel about it that night, calm the way I ask about most things. He didn't even look up from his phone. I moved it around, he said. It's fine. I'll explain later. He didn't explain later. He explained 2 weeks after that at Carol's 60th birthday dinner in front of 12 relatives, a rented private room and a 3-tiered cake nobody had cut yet. I'd brought up the account quietly just between us, stepping toward the hallway by the coat rack. He didn't lower his voice to answer. If anything, he raised it just enough for the table behind us to catch the shape of it. She thinks a filing job makes her a lawyer, he said, laughing to no one and everyone. A few relatives laughed too, the way people do when they're not sure what's funny, but don't want to be the one left out of it. I felt my face go warm. I didn't say anything back. I went to the restroom, ran the cold water over my wrists for longer than I needed to, and when I came back out, I sat down and ate a piece of cake I didn't taste. I'd slipped my notebook into my bag that morning out of habit more than plan. I'd started using it for exactly this: account numbers, dates, the small hard facts I no longer trusted myself to hold only in memory, not after being told so often that my memory of things was the problem. In the car afterward, under the dome light, I wrote down the number. $14,283. And the date. And the sentence he'd said in front of his mother's cake. He must have seen me writing, because on the drive home he reached over and put his hand on my knee, gentle, almost kind, a way you'd calm a nervous dog. "You'll thank me when this is over," he said. I looked out the window at the dark shapes of houses going by, other people's kitchens lit up yellow behind their curtains, and I understood somewhere quiet and certain in my chest that I had stopped hoping this would end softly. I started preparing for it not to. Our son Eli turned 8 on a Saturday in April, and I'd spent the whole week making sure the backyard looked like something out of a magazine. Streamers on the fence, a dinosaur cake he'd picked out himself, both sides of the family crammed into folding chairs around the patio. I was refilling the lemonade pitcher when Daniel tapped his glass with a fork the way people do before a toast. "While everyone's here," he said, smiling out at the yard like a man about to announce good news, "I want to be up front. I'm filing for full custody." The yard went quiet in that particular way a crowd goes quiet when it's deciding whether to be shocked or polite. And honestly, he went on, "Marianne's going to need to find somewhere else to raise the kids after this. It's just not realistic for her to keep the house." Carol nodded before he'd even finished the sentence, already reaching to pat his arm. "He's right, honey," she said to me, gentle as a knife wrapped in a dish towel. "It's better this way. For everyone." I stood there holding a pitcher of lemonade, ice cracking softly against the sides, and I didn't say a word. 12 feet away, my son was blowing bubbles at his cousins, laughing at nothing, completely unaware that his father had just rearranged his whole life out loud over cake. Something in me went very quiet and very clear in that moment, the way water goes still right before it freezes. I thought of Walt. "Keep good records, Marianne. Records outlive people's memories of what they promised." And I remembered with a kind of jolt the cardboard box still sitting in the back corner of my garage behind the winter tires, the one I'd never opened since he died. Walt's files. He'd helped us buy that house 9 years ago, had walked the closing paperwork through with us himself at his own kitchen table, because he didn't trust banks to explain things properly to young people in a hurry. He kept copies of everything. He always kept copies of everything. I decided, standing there in the fading lemonade condensation, that I was done reacting to what this family said out loud at parties. I was going to start building something they couldn't talk their way around. The drive home was quiet, except for the seatbelt chime and Eli picking cake frosting off his fingers in the back seat. I watched him in the rearview mirror, half his mind still back at the party, the other half turning something over. "Mom," he said so quiet I almost missed it under the road noise. "Are we going to lose the house?" I gripped the wheel a little tighter and made my voice as steady as I could make it. "No," I said. "We're not." I meant it as a promise before I even knew how I was going to keep it. That night after he was asleep, I went out to the garage in my socks and pulled Walt's box out from behind the tires, blowing a layer of dust off the lid. The box smelled like old paper and pipe tobacco even after 2 years. I sat cross-legged on the garage floor and went through it the way I'd go through any client's file at work, methodical, unhurried, one folder at a time. Near the bottom, under a stack of tax returns from a decade I barely remembered living through, I found a closing packet from the house. Walt had kept everything. The original mortgage documents, the settlement statement, a copy of the deed with the county stamp still crisp along the edge. And clipped to the front of it in his own handwriting, a letter I had never seen before. It was dated the same week we closed on the house. In it, Walt explained that the down payment, $18,000, had been a gift to both of us jointly, not a loan to Daniel alone, and that he'd co-signed the mortgage specifically so the bank would approve financing at the rate we needed. Then near the bottom, one sentence I read 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. "This gift and this signature are intended to benefit Mary Ann and Daniel equally and permanently, regardless of any future circumstance between them." He'd seen this coming. Or he'd simply refused to leave anything about my future up to chance or to his son's memory of what he'd promised. The next morning at the office, I did what I do for a living. Discovery documents had come in for the custody filing, financial disclosures Daniel's attorney was required to produce, and I went through his recent bank statements the way I'd flag inconsistencies in any client's case. The $14,283 hadn't disappeared. It had moved into an account tied to something called Ridgeline Consulting Group LLC, formed 4 months earlier. No website, no listed clients, no deposits in or out, except that single transfer. In 6 years of doing this job, I'd learned to recognize exactly what an empty shell looks like on paper. This looked like one. I sat back in my chair and reached for my notebook, the same one with the cracked green cover, meaning to jot down the account number. And that's when I saw it laid out plainly across the pages I'd already filled. Every date I'd written down without thinking much about it, the missing money, the birthday dinner, the Thanksgiving flyer, lined up end to end into something I hadn't meant to build, but had built anyway. A timeline. Complete, dated, and entirely in my own handwriting. I closed the notebook slowly and sat with that for a moment. I had the pieces now. What I needed was someone who could make them count. I brought the box, the letter, and the notebook into Loretta Finch's office the following Monday and laid it all out on her desk, without saying much, letting the documents speak the way I'd learned they could. Loretta read Walt's letter twice. Then she looked up at me over her glasses. "Mary Ann," she said, "this isn't just a strong case. This is the kind of paper trail I tell junior associates doesn't exist in real life." She agreed to represent me herself pro bono and told me to start pulling together every exhibit I could find. I didn't need to ask her twice. The weeks that followed moved differently than any weeks had in a long time. At work, I heard through Daniel's coworker's wife, who came into the firm for an unrelated matter, that he'd been telling people at his office he was finally going to get what's his. He'd started talking about the house in the past tense, already like the hearing was a formality standing between him and something he'd already signed for. Carol, I learned, had booked a private room at the same restaurant where she'd hosted her birthday dinner, planning what she was calling to more than one relative a little celebration for after. I spent my evenings differently. After Eli was in bed and the dishes were done, I sat at the kitchen table with a highlighter and Daniel's bank statement spread out under the lamp, the same lamp Walt used to read the newspaper under when he visited on Sundays. I marked every transfer into Ridgeline Consulting, every date that matched an entry in my notebook, cross-referencing until the pattern was undeniable even to someone who didn't want to see it. I took the notebook to a print shop near the courthouse and had it rebind, the cracked green cover, reinforced tabs added along the edge for each category, dates, figures, the letter, the bank records, so that anyone flipping through it could find exactly what they needed in seconds. It had stopped being a habit somewhere in that process. It had become something closer to evidence. The night before the hearing, I laid it all out one final time on the kitchen table, everything tabbed, everything dated, everything in order, and I felt something settle in my chest that hadn't been settled in months. Not confidence exactly. Something quieter than that. Certainty. Daniel called that same evening cheerful to confirm what time I'd be dropping Eli at his mother's the next morning, so we can all go together afterward like a family. I told him I'd see him in the courtroom. He had no idea what was waiting in the folder beside my legal pad. He thought this hearing was a formality he'd already won. All that was left now was walking into that room and letting him find out otherwise. Courtroom 4B filled in slowly that morning the way rooms do when everyone's pretending they're not watching everyone else arrive. Daniel's attorney sat up at the table across from our, sliding folders into neat stacks. Carol took a seat in the second row of the gallery, and beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, sat Priya, wearing a blazer I recognized from a boutique Carol used to take me to back when I was the one she dressed for outings. Daniel stood near the front, adjusting his tie in small unnecessary tugs, the way a man does when he's rehearsing a speech in his head and wants to look the part before he opens his mouth. He caught my eye once briefly and gave me a small, almost pitying smile, the kind you'd give someone about to lose gracefully. Behind me I heard Carol lean toward her sister and whisper just loud enough, "This will finally set things right." Her sister nodded like she already agreed, like the outcome had been decided over coffee weeks ago, and this morning was only the formality of announcing it. I sat with my lawyer, my folder tabbed and squared at the corner of the table, my notebook beside it closed. My hands were steady in a way they hadn't been in months, not because I wasn't nervous, but because for the first time in a long time I had something solid to hold on to besides my own composure. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Has anyone in your life ever used money or a house or the roof over your children's heads as a kind of leash? Not always loudly. Sometimes just in the way they talk about what's theirs. If that's ever happened to you, I hope you're somewhere safe telling this story to yourself the way I'm telling it to you now. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the gallery. All rise. The judge entered, an older man with reading glasses. Pushed up into gray hair and settled behind a bench without hurry, the way people do when they've seen 1,000 mornings exactly like this one and are in no rush to make it 1,001. Daniel straightened his jacket one final time and leaned toward the microphone stand at his table, chin lifted, shoulders back, the posture of a man stepping up to accept something he'd already decided was his. He had no idea the ground under that posture had already shifted. Daniel leaned into the microphone and for a moment the whole courtroom seemed to lean in with him. "Your Honor," he said, voice smooth, rehearsed, "I think it's important the court understands the full picture here. Marianne doesn't have the means to provide real stability for the children. She never has. She has nothing without my name." He said it the way he'd said it to me before, in kitchens and cars, at birthday dinners, in front of relatives who laughed because they didn't know what else to do. But this time it landed in a room built to weigh things carefully, and the silence that followed it wasn't the kind he was used to. My lawyer rose beside me, unhurried, buttoning her jacket as she stood. "Your Honor, if I may, we'd like to enter 2 exhibits into the record." The judge nodded and she carried the folder forward herself, the same folder that had been sitting closed beside my legal pad since I walked in. "The first," she said, "is a signed letter from the late Walter Weller, the respondent's father, executed at the time of the property's closing. In it, Mr. Weller states clearly that the down payment on the marital home was a joint gift to both parties, and that his co-signature on the mortgage was intended, in his words, to benefit Marianne and Daniel equally and permanently, regardless of any future circumstance between them." The judge took his time reading it. He turned the page over once, checking the notarization stamp on the back, then set it down. "The second exhibit," my lawyer continued, "is a forensic summary of transfers totaling $14,283, moved from the parties' joint savings account into an entity called Ridgeline Consulting Group LLC, a shell company with no operating activity, formed 4 months prior to these proceedings. These transfers are cross-referenced here against a dated personal log kept by my client, establishing that marital assets were concealed during the pendency of an active custody filing." The judge looked up first at the folder, then at Daniel, whose confident posture had gone very still, the kind of stillness that isn't calm at all. "Counsel," he said to Daniel's attorney, "were you aware of this shell account?" Daniel's lawyer opened his mouth and then closed it again, glancing sideways at his client for an answer that wasn't coming. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Weller, is there anything you'd like to add?" I stood. I didn't reach for my notes. I didn't need to. "The house was never his to threaten me with," I said. "His father made sure of that before he could." The room didn't gasp. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for it. I heard Carol's sharp intake of breath 2 rows back, saw her hand come up to her mouth, her face going the color of the folder still sitting open on the table. Beside her, Priya's eyes cut sideways toward Daniel, sharp and searching, the look of someone doing fast math on a relationship she thought she understood. Daniel didn't move. He stared at the letter like it might rearrange itself if he looked at it long enough, like his father's handwriting could somehow be argued with the way he'd once argued with everything else. The judge set the folder down and folded his hands. "Mr. Weller," he said, "I'm going to need your counsel to explain on the record why this account wasn't disclosed." Somewhere behind me I heard Carol whisper his name, tight and urgent, the sound of a woman realizing the room she'd walked into confident wasn't the room she was going to walk out of. Daniel's lawyer stood first, smoothing his tie, buying himself a second to think. "Your Honor, given the nature of these exhibits, we'd request a recess to review them properly before denied," the judge said, not unkindly, just final. "You'll have time to respond in writing. Right now I'd like to understand what's in front of me." Daniel leaned forward, unable to stay quiet any longer. "That letter is old, Your Honor. It's 10 years old. It doesn't reflect. It's dated, witnessed and notarized," the judge said, cutting him off without raising his voice, which somehow made it worse than if he had. "And nothing in this file shows it was ever revoked, amended or contested by either party until this morning. Its age doesn't diminish its validity. If anything, Mr. Weller, the fact that it stood unchallenged for this long tells me quite a bit." Daniel opened his mouth again and found apparently that there was nothing left to put in it. Behind me I heard Carol lean toward him, her voice a sharp whisper meant to carry only to him, and landing instead in the ears of half the gallery. "Say something," she hissed. "Daniel. Say something." He didn't. He sat there with his hands flat on the table, the same way mine had been flat on my own table an hour ago, except his weren't holding steady. His weren't holding anything at all. Beside Carol, Priya had gone very quiet, her phone tilted just slightly in her lap, thumb moving across the screen in small distracted taps, the particular stillness of someone doing arithmetic on a future she'd been picturing differently an hour ago. The judge turned a page in the folder unhurried. "I also want to note," he said, "that these concealed transfers directly contradict the financial disclosures filed by Mr. Weller in this case. That's not a small inconsistency. It goes to credibility, and credibility is something I weigh on every claim before me today, including custody." He looked at Daniel over the top of his glasses. "A parent who conceals $14,000 during active proceedings is not a parent I can currently trust to represent his finances or his intentions accurately to this court." Nobody in the gallery moved. Somewhere behind me I heard a small rustle, paper against fabric, and I turned just enough to see Carol fumbling in her purse for a tissue, her hand shaking. As she dug past her wallet, his small stack of envelopes slid halfway out, thick cream-colored cardstock, the kind used for invitations. I recognized the restaurant's logo printed in the corner. A celebration for after, she'd called it. She shoved them back down quickly, but not quickly enough. Not fast enough that I didn't see them, or that the judge, glancing up at the small commotion, didn't see them too. Daniel just sat there staring at his father's handwriting, looking for a version of this morning he no longer had access to. Daniel called 11 times over the following 3 weeks. I know, because I wrote each one down the same way I'd written everything else, out of habit now more than necessity. The calls followed a pattern. Apology first, soft and rehearsed. Then somewhere around the second or third minute, blame creeping back in like water finding its old path. "I didn't mean it like that," he said once, about the line he'd said to the judge to me, to a room full of people who'd believed him right up until they didn't. "You know, I didn't mean you have nothing. It's just a thing people say." I let that sit on the line for a moment before I answered. "You said it clearly enough for a judge to write it down," I told him, and then I said I had to go start dinner, and I did. Carol came by the house one Saturday without calling, first standing on the porch with a casserole dish, like the last few months hadn't happened, like the flyer in her purse and the invitations in her bag were things she could set down along with the dish and walk away from. "I just want us to be able to move forward," she said, "for the kids' sake." "You can see the kids," I told her, holding the door only halfway open. "You don't get to see me apologize for keeping what was always mine." She didn't have anything to say to that. I closed the door gently, not slammed, just closed, and went back to the kitchen where Eli was doing homework at the table Walt used to sit at on Sunday mornings. The rest unfolded the way these things do when the truth finally has somewhere official to land. Daniel's employer, a firm with strict conflict of interest policies written into every contract, opened its own review once the shell company surfaced in the court record. He was let go 6 weeks later. The same month, the court ordered him to pay back support and cover a portion of my legal fees, on top of what Ridgeline Consulting had never actually been used for. The house stayed mine outright. Physical custody stayed exactly where it had always functionally been with me, only now with paper behind it, instead of just love. I didn't feel triumphant exactly when it was all finished. I felt something quieter. Something closer to relief, the kind that comes not from winning loudly, but from finally not having to brace for the next thing. The notebook sits on my kitchen counter now next to the food bowl, its ribbon spine a little less cracked than it used to be. I use it for grocery lists these days. Milk. Eggs. Eli's cleat size too before he outgrows them again. Some evenings I still catch myself looking at that notebook the way you'd look at an old coat you almost gave away. Green cover cracked at the corner, sitting closed by the fruit bowl like it never held anything more urgent than milk and eggs. I think about Walt more than I probably let on. A man who sat on a back porch with a quiet daughter-in-law and decided without ever making a show of it that her worth in that family shouldn't depend on his son remembering to honor it. He put it in writing instead. He made sure it could outlast him because he understood better than most people ever do that memory bends and paper doesn't. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. A name was never what protected me. The truth I kept records of was. I don't have the big family anymore, the holidays with 12 relatives and a seating chart. What I have instead is smaller, and I've come to learn sturdier. My son growing an inch every time I turn around. The memory of a father-in-law who saw me clearly when almost no one else bothered to. A version of family built on people who actually showed up instead of people who simply expected to be shown to. That's enough. It's more than enough most days. If this story felt familiar to you, if some part of it landed somewhere close to home, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what you kept, the record, the promise, the proof that ended up being the thing that saved you.